Hello there, and welcome to Earth's history, where we trace the footsteps of our ancestors across continents and millennia, where every human alive today shares a common story, where the greatest journey ever taken unfolded, not in spaceships or sailing vessels, but on foot, one generation at a time, across a world that was both familiar and utterly alien to the people who traversed it. Tonight, we're following humanity's most epic adventure, the story of how a small population of humans in Africa, perhaps only a few thousand individuals, walked out of their ancestral homeland and spread across the entire planet, adapting to every environment from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, from coastal shores to high mountain plateaus, from deserts to islands, becoming the most widely distributed large mammal on Earth. This is the story of your ancestors, of the people who left Africa between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, who crossed deserts and mountains and seas, who survived ice ages and droughts and predators, who developed new technologies and new cultures, who painted caves and buried their dead and told stories around fires, who eventually reached every habitable continent, who became the Australians and the Europeans and the Asians and the Americans, who became us. If you've ever wondered where you came from, if you've ever felt a stirring when you see wild places and open horizons, if you've ever marveled at human diversity while recognizing our fundamental unity, you're about to discover something profound. We are all Africans. Every person on Earth, regardless of what they look like, where they live, what language they speak, descends from people who lived in Africa. And the journey that brought your ancestors from that homeland to wherever your family is now is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of life on this planet. Wherever you are right now, I hope you're comfortable, settled in, ready to walk alongside your ancestors through deep time and across vast distances. Maybe you're lying in bed as the evening settles around you. Maybe you're sitting quietly, letting the day's concerns fade. Maybe you're in that peaceful space where you can imagine yourself elsewhere, walking ancient path that your ancestors once walked. If this journey into our shared human story brings you a sense of connection, if it helps you understand that we're all family, all descendants of the same small population of African adventurers, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video, subscribe to the channel, or share it with someone else who might find meaning in knowing that we all come from the same place, that we all made the same journey, just at different times, along different routes. So settle in. Let your breathing slow like the patient rhythm of walking, day after day, generation after generation. Let your thoughts drift across landscapes your ancestors once crossed. And let's begin. Because somewhere in Africa, around 70,000 years ago, a small group of people stood at the edge of everything they knew, looked toward the horizon, and began to walk. They didn't know they were starting the greatest migration in human history. They were just moving, following game, seeking water, looking for a better place. But that movement, continued by their children and their children's children for thousands of generations, would take humanity to every corner of the earth. Before we follow our ancestors out of Africa, we need to understand where they came from, who they were, what made them human. We need to go back further to the origins of our species to see how Homo sapiens emerged from earlier human relatives, how we became the people who would eventually walk across the world. The story begins about 7 million years ago in Africa, when the lineage that would become humans split from the lineage that would become chimpanzees and bonobos, our closest living relative. This split wasn't dramatic, wasn't sudden, it was gradual. A population of apes in Africa slowly diverging into two groups, one that would stay in the forest and remain mostly arboreal, and another that would venture into more open woodland and grassland environment. This second group, our ancestors, began to adapt to a life partly on the ground. They started walking upright more consistently, freeing their hands for carrying food and tools. Their diet became more varied, including more meat and tubers. Their brains began to grow larger, though this was a slow process, spanning millions of years. These early hominins, as we call them, weren't humans yet. They weren't even in the genus Homo. They were earlier forms, Australopithecus and related genera, walking upright but still climbing trees, using simple tools but not making complex ones, living in Africa and only in Africa. Around 2.5 to 3 million years ago, the genus Homo appeared, the group that would eventually include us. Early species like Homo habilis and Homo erectus had larger brains than earlier hominin, made more sophisticated stone tools, and began to eat more meat, which may have provided the calories needed to support those larger, more energy-hungry brains. Homo erectus is particularly important to our story because this species was the first to leave Africa, around 1.8 to 2 million years ago. Homo erectus fossils have been found across Africa, in Europe, in the Middle East, across Asia, all the way to Indonesia. These people walked out of Africa long before Homo sapiens existed, colonizing much of the Old World, adapting to new environment, developing new tools and behavior. For over 1 million years, Homo erectus and related species lived across Africa and Eurasia, diversifying into different populations. In Europe and Western Asia, these populations evolved into Neanderthals, robust humans adapted to cold climate, with large brains and sophisticated tools and culture. In Asia, other populations evolved into Denisovan, a mysterious group known mainly from DNA, and a few fossil fragments found in Siberia and Tibet. In Africa, populations evolved toward modern humans, toward Homo sapiens, toward us. The exact timeline of when Homo sapiens emerged is debated and constantly being refined as new fossils are discovered and new dating techniques are developed. The oldest fossils that are definitely Homo sapiens come from Morocco, from a site called Jebel Irhoud, dated to about 300,000 years ago. These people had skulls that are recognizably modern in some features, relatively flat faces, smaller brow ridges, but still retained some archaic characteristics. Other early Homo sapiens fossils come from Ethiopia, from sites like Omokibish and Herto, dated to about 195,000 and 160,000 years ago, respectively. These fossils show a trend toward fully modern human anatomy: high foreheads, rounded skulls, prominent chins, relatively gracile skeleton. By 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern human, people who would look essentially like us if you saw them today, existed in Africa. They had our body proportion, our brain size, our facial features. But did they think like us? Did they have language, symbolic thought, complex culture, all the things we consider distinctively human? This is a harder question to answer, because behavior doesn't fossilize as readily as bone. But we have clues. Archaeological sites in Africa from this period show evidence of sophisticated toolmaking, the use of pigments like red ochre, possibly for body decoration, the creation of shell beads for personal ornament, the exploitation of marine resources like shellfish. These behaviors suggest symbolic thinking, planning, social complexity, the kinds of cognitive abilities that characterize modern humans. So by 100,000 years ago, and probably earlier, there were people in Africa who were essentially modern, physically and mentally. They looked like us, thought like us, lived in social groups with language and culture, made tools and art, adapted to their environments with flexibility and intelligence. These were our direct ancestors, the people from whom all living humans descend. But for tens of thousands of years, these early Homo sapiens stayed in Africa. There's evidence of a possible early exit around 120,000 to 90,000 years ago, with fossils from sites in the Middle East suggesting some populations moved into the Levant, the region that is now Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. But this early expansion seems to have been temporary or limited. These populations either died out or retreated back into Africa, possibly driven by climate changes that made the Levant less habitable. The successful migration, the one that would lead to the permanent colonization of the entire world, happened later, around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago. This is the migration that matters for our story, the one from which all non-African populations descend, the one that took humanity from a single continent to 6 continents in just a few tens of thousands of years. What triggered this migration? Why did people leave Africa around 70,000 years ago when they had existed there for hundreds of thousands of years before? This is one of the great questions in human prehistory, and there's no single agreed upon answer. One possibility is climate change. Around 70,000 years ago, a supervolcano called Toba erupted in what is now Indonesia, producing one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the past few million years. This eruption ejected so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that it may have caused a volcanic winter, a period of global cooling that lasted years or even decades. Some scientists have proposed that this cooling stressed human population, reducing their numbers dramatically, a population bottleneck, and that the migration out of Africa was partly a response to these harsh conditions, with people seeking new territories and resources. This Toba catastrophe theory is controversial, with some evidence supporting it and other evidence suggesting humans were less affected than the theory proposes. But regardless of whether Toba specifically triggered the migration, climate certainly played a role. The period from about 100,000 to 50,000 years ago was one of climatic instability, with fluctuations between cooler, drier periods and warmer, wetter ones. These changes would have affected the availability of food and water, the distribution of plants and animals, the habitability of different regions. During dry periods, deserts expanded, blocking routes out of Africa. During wetter periods, rivers flowed through what are now arid regions. Vegetation spread, game animals moved into new areas, and corridors opened that would allow human migration. The successful migration around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago may have coincided with one of these wetter periods, when the Sahara and Arabian deserts were less formidable barriers, when rivers and lakes provided pathways and resources for people moving northeast. But climate alone probably doesn't explain the migration. Humans are adaptable, intelligent, capable of surviving in marginal environments. What may have been equally important was cultural and technological innovation. Around the time of the migration, there's evidence of increasingly sophisticated behavior, more complex tools, more efficient hunting and gathering strategy, better use of fire, possibly boats or rafts for crossing water. These innovations may have reached a threshold where humans became capable of successfully expanding into new environments, of outcompeting or displacing the archaic human population, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others who already occupied Eurasia. There's also a possibility that language played a role. If fully modern language with complex grammar and large vocabulary and the ability to communicate abstract ideas emerged or became more developed around this time, it would have provided enormous advantages. Language allows more effective cooperation, more efficient transmission of knowledge, better planning, and coordination. A group with sophisticated language could outcompete groups without it, could adapt more quickly to new environments, could maintain social cohesion across larger populations and greater distances. Whatever the specific triggers, the result was clear. Sometime around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, a group of humans left Africa. They were probably not a large group. Genetic studies suggest the founding population that gave rise to all non-Africans might have been only a few thousand individuals, perhaps only a few hundred. They left from the Horn of Africa, the eastern bulge of the continent that includes modern Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia. From there, they crossed into the Arabian Peninsula, possibly crossing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow gap between Africa and Arabia at the southern end of the Red Sea. This strait is only about 20 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and during periods of lower sea level, which occurred during ice ages when water was locked up in glaciers, it might have been even narrower, possibly even a land bridge. Even if it wasn't a land bridge, people could have crossed by boat or raft, as archaeological evidence suggests that humans were capable of sea crossings by this time. Once in Arabia, these migrants found themselves in a world that was different from the Africa they left. During wetter periods, Arabia wasn't the desert it is today. It had rivers and lakes, grasslands and woodlands, populations of animals, gazelles, oryx, ostrich, that could be hunted. Archaeological sites in Arabia show evidence of human occupation around this time, stone tools and campsites indicating that people were living and thriving there. From Arabia, the migration split into multiple paths. Some people moved north into the Levant, and from there into Europe, where they would eventually replace the Neanderthals. Others moved east along the coast of the Indian Ocean, following the shores of what is now Iran, Pakistan, India, Southeast Asia. This coastal route is particularly important because it seems to have been the main pathway for the initial rapid expansion across Asia. The coast provided reliable resources, fish, shellfish, seabirds, seals, that didn't require extensive knowledge of local plants and animals. Even in unfamiliar territory, people could feed themselves by exploiting marine and coastal resources. The climate along tropical and subtropical coasts was relatively stable and hospitable, not requiring major adaptations in clothing or shelter. Evidence for this coastal migration comes from several sources. Genetic studies of modern populations show that coastal populations in India, Southeast Asia, and Australasia share genetic similarities that suggest a rapid migration along the coast. Archaeological sites along the coast, though rare because many would now be underwater due to rising sea levels since the Ice Age, show human occupation from relatively early periods, and the pattern of human arrival in different regions, reaching Southeast Asia and Australia very early, but interior regions like Central Asia later, suggests a coastal route followed by gradual movement inland. By about 50,000 to 45,000 years ago, humans had reached Southeast Asia and had made the remarkable crossing to Australia. This crossing required boats capable of ocean voyages because even during the lowest sea level, when much of Southeast Asia was connected by land bridges forming a continent called Sundaland, there was always a significant water gap between Sundaland and Australia, a stretch of ocean at least 70 to 100 kilometers wide. The fact that humans reached Australia so early, possibly by 65,000 years ago, according to some controversial date, definitely by 45,000 years ago, tells us that they had sophisticated maritime technology and navigation skills. They weren't just drifting on rafts. They were deliberately voyaging, possibly in groups with families and supplies, crossing stretches of ocean they couldn't see the other side of, reaching islands, and eventually the Australian continent. Once in Australia, these first Australians spread across the continent relatively quickly, reaching the southern coast within a few thousand years. They adapted to a wide range of environments: tropical north, arid interior, temperate south, developing different technologies and strategies for each. They became, in a very real sense, the Aboriginal Australian, the indigenous people of that continent, maintaining cultural continuity for over 50,000 years, one of the longest continuous cultural traditions in human history. Meanwhile, other groups of migrants were moving in different directions from the Middle East and Central Asia. Some moved north into Europe, arriving around 45,000 to 40,000 years ago. These were the people who would replace the Neanderthals, who would paint the magnificent cave art of France and Spain, who would survive the harsh conditions of the last ice age in Europe. The interaction between these incoming Homo sapiens and the resident Neanderthals is one of the most fascinating chapters in human history. Neanderthals had lived in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were well adapted to the cold climate, physically robust, with large brains and sophisticated tools and culture. They hunted large game, used fire, made clothing, buried their dead, possibly had symbolic behavior and language. When modern humans arrived in Neanderthal territory, there was a period of overlap, perhaps several thousand years, when both groups lived in the same region. What happened during this time is intensely debated. Did they compete violently? Did they avoid each other? Did they trade and interact peacefully? The genetic evidence provides a clear answer to at least one question: they interbred. DNA studies show that most non-African people today carry Neanderthal DNA, about 1 to 2% of their genome coming from Neanderthal ancestors. This means that at some point, humans and Neanderthals had children together, and those hybrid offspring survived, reproduced, and contributed their genes to the modern human population. The interbreeding probably happened early in the migration, possibly in the Middle East, where humans first encountered Neanderthals, because the Neanderthal DNA is shared by all non-African populations, including those that went to Asia and Australia and never lived near Neanderthals in Europe. This suggests a limited period of mixing, perhaps when the populations first met, followed by the spread of people carrying those Neanderthal genes to different parts of the world. But interbreeding doesn't mean the two groups merged or lived peacefully together for long periods. After the initial mixing, human and Neanderthal populations seem to have remained largely separate, and ultimately, Neanderthals went extinct, disappearing from the fossil record by about 40,000 years ago, possibly persisting in a few refugia until about 30,000 years ago before vanishing completely. Why did Neanderthals go extinct while humans thrive? This is another major question with no definitive answer. Possible factors include competition for resources. Humans and Neanderthals exploited similar resources. They both hunted large game, both needed shelter and fire, both occupied the same types of environment. Humans may have been more efficient hunters, more effective at extracting resources from the environment, gradually outcompeting Neanderthals for food and territory. Superior technology. Humans seem to have had more sophisticated tools, including better projectile weapons like spear throwers and possibly bows and arrows, allowing them to hunt more effectively from a distance. They also had needles for sewing fitted clothing, which would have provided better insulation in cold climate. Larger social network. Evidence suggests humans maintained larger social networks and engaged in more long-distance exchange of materials and ideas. This would have provided advantages in knowledge sharing, access to resources, and resilience to local environmental changes. Demographic advantages. Humans may have had higher population density, faster population growth rate, or better survival rates for children, giving them a demographic edge over time. Even small differences in these factors could lead to one population eventually replacing another over thousands of years. Disease. Humans might have carried diseases to which Neanderthals had no immunity, though there's no direct evidence for this, and it remains speculative. Climate change. The period when Neanderthals went extinct was one of climatic instability, with rapid fluctuations between cold and warm periods. Neanderthals may have been less able to adapt to these rapid changes than the more behaviorally flexible humans. Likely, it was a combination of these factors rather than any single cause that led to Neanderthal extinction. But the result was that by about 30,000 years ago, humans were the only human species left in Europe, the only ones in Western Asia, the survivors of a competition that had been running for thousands of years. Similar stories played out in other regions. In Asia, humans encountered Denisovan, another archaic human group. We know less about Denisovans because we have fewer fossils, mostly DNA extracted from a few bones and teeth found in a cave in Siberia. But that DNA tells us Denisovans were a distinct group, related to Neanderthals but genetically different, who lived across a wide area of Asia, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, possibly even reaching Oceania. Like with Neanderthals, humans and Denisovans interbred. Modern populations in Melanesia, Australia, and parts of Southeast Asia carry significant amounts of Denisovan DNA, up to 5% in some populations, indicating substantial mixing between the groups. This mixing probably happened as humans moved through Southeast Asia and encountered Denisovan populations living there. And like Neanderthals, Denisovans eventually went extinct, disappearing from the fossil record, leaving only their DNA in modern humans as evidence of their existence. By about 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was the only human species left on Earth, the last survivor of a once diverse human family tree. While some humans were settling Europe and replacing Neanderthals, others were pushing further into Asia. They moved north into Siberia, adapting to some of the coldest environments humans had yet encountered. They developed technologies for surviving Arctic conditions, sewn fur clothing, sophisticated shelters, efficient hunting of large mammals like mammoths and woolly rhinos. These northern populations became the ancestors of modern Native Americans, though it would take many thousands of years before anyone actually reached the Americas. The peopling of the Americas was one of the last major chapters in the human migration out of Africa, and one of the most remarkable. The Americas were unreachable for most of human history because they're separated from Asia by the Bering Strait, a stretch of ocean between Siberia and Alaska. But during ice ages, when sea levels dropped, this strait became a land bridge, Beringia, connecting Asia and North America. Beringia wasn't just a narrow bridge, but a large region, perhaps 1,000 kilometers wide, with its own ecosystem, its own populations of animals and plants. Humans reached Beringia probably by about 25,000 to 30,000 years ago, living in this region for possibly thousands of years, hunting mammoths and other large game, developing adaptations to Arctic life. But they couldn't move south into the rest of the Americas because the way was blocked by massive ice sheet. The Laurentide ice sheet covering most of Canada and parts of the northern United States. The Cordilleran ice sheet covering the mountains of western Canada. These ice sheets, miles thick in places, made it impossible to travel from Alaska into the rest of North America by land. People had to wait for the climate to warm, for the ice to melt enough to open a corridor. This happened around 15,000 to 13,000 years ago, as the last ice age was ending. The ice sheets began to retreat, opening an ice-free corridor east of the Rocky Mountain, a pathway between the two great ice sheets. At roughly the same time, the Pacific coast became ice-free, offering a coastal route south. Which route did the first Americans take? This is debated. The traditional view was the ice-free corridor, but recent evidence suggests the coastal route may have been earlier and more important. Coastal sites in California and South America have produced dates suggesting human presence by 14,000 to 15,000 years ago, possibly even earlier, implying that people moved south along the coast before the interior corridor was fully open. The coastal route would have required boats, but we know humans had maritime technology by this time. After all, They'd reached Australia tens of thousands of years earlier. Moving along the coast, stopping at river mouths and bays rich in resources, people could have traveled from Alaska to the tip of South America relatively rapidly, in just a few thousand years, and that's apparently what happened. Archaeological sites across the Americas show that humans reached the southern tip of South America, Patagonia, by at least 13,000 to 14,000 years ago, possibly earlier. This means that in just 1,000 to 2,000 years, humans traveled from Alaska to Patagonia, over 15,000 kilometers, through every climate zone and ecosystem on the continent, adapting as they went. This rapid spread was made possible by several factors. The Americas were rich in large game animals, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, camels that had never encountered human hunters and were probably easy prey. This abundance of food supported rapid population growth and expansion. The Americas were also completely uninhabited by humans, with no competition from other human populations, allowing the first arrivals to expand into empty territory without resistance. But this rapid colonization had consequences. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of the large mammals in the Americas went extinct. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, giant armadillos, horses, camels, and many others. Over 80% of large mammal species in North America disappeared, and South America experienced similar losses. The cause of these extinctions is debated. Climate change at the end of the Ice Age certainly played a role, altering habitats and ecosystems, but many scientists believe human hunting was a major factor, if not the primary one. The overkill hypothesis proposes that human hunters, encountering naive prey populations that had never experienced human predation, hunted them unsustainably, driving species after species to extinction. Similar extinction events occurred wherever humans arrived for the first time. In Australia, the arrival of humans around 50,000 years ago was followed by the extinction of the megafauna, giant kangaroos, marsupial lions, enormous wombat, huge flightless birds. On islands across the Pacific, the arrival of humans was followed by waves of extinction, particularly of flightless birds that had evolved in the absence of mammalian predators. These extinctions show both the power of humans to shape ecosystems and the vulnerability of wildlife that evolved without human presence. Humans weren't just passive colonizers, moving into empty territories. They were active agents of change, transforming the environments they entered, driving some species extinct, favoring others, reshaping food webs and ecosystems. By about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, humans had reached every major landmass except Antarctica. From an origin in Africa, from a founding population of perhaps only a few thousand individuals, humans had spread across 6 continents, had diversified into thousands of distinct populations, speaking different languages and practicing different cultures, had adapted to every environment from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest to high-altitude mountain to small remote island. This expansion was one of the most rapid and complete colonizations by any large mammal in Earth's history. No other species even approaches the geographical range of human. We're on every continent, in nearly every ecosystem, from pole to pole, from sea level to the highest mountain. And all of this happened in just 60,000 to 70,000 years, a blink of an eye in evolutionary time. Let's pause for a moment to consider what this migration meant in human terms, in the experience of the individuals who actually made the journey. Imagine being part of one of these migrating groups, living 50,000 or 40,000 or 20,000 years ago, moving through unfamiliar territory with your family, your clan, your small community of a few dozen people. You're walking day after day, following game, seeking water, looking for the resources you need to survive. You might travel only a few kilometers in a day, stopping to camp when you find a good location, staying for days or weeks if resources are abundant, moving on when game becomes scarce or water dries up. You're not deliberately trying to reach some distant destination. You're just living, moving, adapting to the local environment. But generation after generation, the movement continued. Your children settle a little further from where you were born. Their children move a little further still. Over centuries and millennia, these small incremental movements add up to continental distances. Without any conscious intention to colonize the world, without any awareness that you're part of a great migration, you and your descendants gradually spread across vast territory. What did you see? What landscape? What animal? What wonders did you encounter that have now vanished? You might have watched herds of mammoths grazing in grasslands that are now forests or deserts. You might have hunted giant ground sloths, animals the size of elephants that stood on their hind legs to reach vegetation. You might have seen flocks of enormous flightless birds, or marsupial lions stalking through Australian woodlands, or giant beaver the size of bears building dams in North American rivers. All of these creatures are gone now, extinct, known only from fossils. But to you, they were part of everyday life. The animals you hunted or avoided. The wildlife that shared your world. The landscapes, too, were different. During ice ages, coastlines were further out because sea level was lower. Rivers flowed through different channels. Lakes existed that are now dry. Glaciers covered regions that are now temperate. The world you inhabited was in many ways more alien than any place on Earth today. Yet in other ways, it was familiar. The sun rose and set. Seasons changed. Rain fell. Plants grew. People were born, lived, and died. You loved and feared and hoped and dreamed. You told stories, sang songs, played with children, mourned losses. The fundamentals of human experience were the same then as now, even if the setting was vastly different. What motivated you to keep moving? Probably not curiosity or a desire to explore, though those might have played a role. More likely, you moved because you had to, because resources were depleted, because population pressure pushed you into new territories, because conflict with neighboring groups made staying dangerous, because climate changes made your current location less habitable. But you also moved because you could. Humans are uniquely adapted for long-distance walking. We're endurance specialists capable of covering 20 or 30 kilometers in a day if necessary, day after day, week after week. Our upright posture is efficient for walking. Our legs are long. Our feet are springy and shock-absorbing. Our bodies are good at cooling through sweating, allowing us to travel in hot conditions when other animals must rest. This walking ability, combined with intelligence and adaptability, made humans extraordinarily effective colonizers. We could walk into new territories, assess the resources, figure out what was edible and what was dangerous, develop strategies for hunting local game and processing local plants, adapt our tools and techniques to new conditions. Within a single generation, within even a single lifetime, people could learn to thrive in environments radically different from where they were born. This adaptability was enhanced by culture, by the ability to transmit knowledge from one generation to the next through teaching and storytelling. If someone discovered that a particular plant was edible or that a particular hunting technique worked well on local game, that knowledge could be shared, could spread through the population, could be passed to children and grandchildren. Culture accumulated, with each generation adding to the knowledge base, refining techniques, developing new innovations. Language was crucial to this cultural transmission. With language, people could share detailed information about the environment, could warn about dangers, could coordinate complex group activities like hunts, could pass on abstract concepts and social rules. Language allowed culture to become cumulative, with each generation standing on the shoulders of previous generations, building on what had been learned before. As humans spread across the world, populations became separated, isolated by distance and geographical barriers. Groups that moved to Australia had no contact with groups that stayed in Africa or moved to Europe. Groups that crossed into the Americas were cut off from Asia by rising sea levels after the Ice Age, isolated for over 10,000 years until European contact in the 15th century. This isolation led to divergence. Separated populations experienced different selective pressures, adapted to different environments, developed different physical characteristics. Over thousands of years, these differences accumulated, creating the diversity of human appearance we see today. Differences in skin color, hair texture, facial features, body proportions. These differences are superficial, the result of local adaptations to particular environments. Skin color, for example, is largely determined by latitude, by the amount of UV radiation. Near the equator, dark skin provides protection against UV damage. Far from the equator, where UV is less intense, but where vitamin D synthesis in the skin is important, lighter skin is advantageous. Hair texture, nose shape, eyelid structure, All of these show adaptations to local climate conditions. But beneath these superficial differences, humans remain remarkably similar. Genetic studies show that there's more genetic variation within populations than between them, that the concept of biological races has no scientific validity, that all humans are fundamentally the same species, interfertile and closely related. The differences we notice, skin color, facial features, involve only a tiny fraction of our gene. The vast majority of our genome is shared, reflecting our recent common ancestry. This genetic similarity is evidence of the recent migration. All non-African populations descend from a small founding group that left Africa only 70,000 years ago. That's approximately 3,000 generations, a very short time in evolutionary terms. There simply hasn't been enough time for major genetic divergence, for populations to become substantially different from each other. Even the populations that stayed in Africa, that have been separated longest from other groups, are genetically similar to everyone else. In fact, African populations show more genetic diversity than all non-African populations combined, because they've had longer to accumulate mutations, longer for genetic lineages to diverge. This high diversity in Africa is more evidence that it's the ancestral homeland, the place where humans have lived longest. The journey out of Africa also left its mark in languages. Of the approximately 7,000 languages spoken in the world today, they all descend from languages spoken by the people who made the migration. As populations spread and separated, their languages diverged, splitting into language families that became increasingly different over time. Some of these families are enormous, spoken across vast areas. The Indo-European language family, for example, includes languages from India to Ireland, from Russian to Portuguese, all descended from a common ancestral language, spoken perhaps 6,000 years ago in the steppes of Central Asia. As speakers of this language spread through migration and conquest and cultural diffusion, the language split into different branches: Germanic, Romance, Slavic, Indo-Iranian, each branch splitting further into individual languages. Other language families are more localized. Papua New Guinea, despite being a relatively small island, has over 800 languages, more linguistic diversity than any other comparable area. This reflects the island's geography, rugged mountains and valleys that isolate populations, and its history. People have lived there for over 40,000 years, long enough for languages to diverge extensively. The patterns of language diversity across the world provide clues about migration routes and timing. Generally, areas that were colonized more recently have less linguistic diversity because there's been less time for languages to diverge. The Americas, colonized only in the last 15,000 years, have moderate linguistic diversity. Australia, colonized about 50,000 years ago, has higher diversity. Africa, humanity's homeland, has the highest diversity, with languages so different they can't be grouped into any superfamily encompassing the whole continent. Along with languages, the migration spread cultures, beliefs, technologies, ways of life. Each population developed its own unique culture, but all cultures share certain universal features: language, kinship systems, rules about marriage and property, religious beliefs, artistic expression, musical traditions. These universals reflect our shared human nature, the cognitive and social capacities that we all inherited from our African ancestors. But the specific expressions of these universals vary enormously. Musical traditions range from the complex rhythms of West African drumming, to the overtone singing of Mongolia, to the polyphonic harmonies of European choral music. Artistic traditions range from the rock paintings of Australia to the elaborate carvings of Pacific Islanders, to the cave paintings of Europe. Religious beliefs range from animism to polytheism to monotheism, from ancestor worship to shamanism, to organized religions with sacred texts and complex theology. This cultural diversity is one of humanity's great treasures, a testament to our creativity and adaptability. Each culture represents a unique solution to the challenges of human existence, a unique way of making meaning, of organizing society, of relating to the environment and to each other. The loss of any culture through language death or assimilation or extinction is a loss for all humanity, a closing off of possibilities, a diminishment of our collective heritage. The journey out of Africa also brought humans into contact with new diseases, new parasites, new pathogens. Each environment had its own disease ecology, and as humans moved into new territories, they encountered new threats to their health. Malaria in tropical regions, plague in temperate zones, parasitic worms in various forms across different environments. Humans had to adapt to all of these. Some adaptations were genetic. The sickle cell trait, for example, provides partial protection against malaria, which is why it's common in populations from malarial regions of Africa and has persisted despite causing disease in individuals who inherit 2 copies of the gene. Lactose tolerance, the ability to digest milk as adults, evolved independently in several populations that practice dairy herding, providing a nutritional advantage from being able to consume milk throughout life rather than just in infancy. Other adaptations were cultural and technological. People learned which plants had medicinal properties, developing pharmacopoeias of herbal remedies that formed the basis of traditional medicine in every culture. They learned behaviors that reduced disease transmission, food preparation techniques, waste disposal practices, isolation of sick individuals. They developed shamanic and religious practices around healing, some of which had genuine therapeutic effects through psychological mechanism or through the use of effective plant compound. But despite these adaptations, disease remained a major factor in human life, a constant present, a source of suffering and mortality that affected everyone. Life expectancy was short by modern standards, probably 25 to 35 years on average for hunter-gatherers, with high infant mortality and significant death rates from infection, injury, and childbirth. People lived with pain and disability in ways we can barely imagine today, without antibiotics, without surgery beyond the most basic procedures, without pain management beyond what could be provided by plant-based remedies. And yet, people persisted, communities survived, populations grew, knowledge accumulated, culture developed. Humans didn't just survive in their new environment. They thrived, they adapted, they created rich lives filled with meaning despite the hardship. Part 4. The development of complex society. For most of human history, for the entire period of the migration out of Africa, and for tens of thousands of years before, people lived as hunter-gatherers. They moved with the season, following game animals, harvesting wild plants, living in small bands of a few dozen individuals, connected to other bands through kinship and alliance networks. This way of life was successful, sustainable, had supported humans for hundreds of thousands of years. Hunter-gatherers weren't primitive or unsuccessful. They were highly skilled, deeply knowledgeable about their environment, socially sophisticated, capable of thriving in diverse ecosystems, from Arctic to tropical. In many ways, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle was easier and healthier than the agricultural life that would replace it. Hunter-gatherers worked fewer hours, had more varied diets, were taller and healthier than early farmers, had more leisure time for social activities and artistic pursuits. But around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, something changed. In several different regions of the world, independently and at roughly the same time, people began to transition from foraging to food production, from hunting and gathering to agriculture and animal husbandry. This transition, known as the Neolithic Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution, would transform human life more profoundly than perhaps any other development in our history. The transition didn't happen everywhere at once. It occurred independently in several centers of origin: the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the Yellow River and Yangtze River valleys of China, the highlands of New Guinea, Mesoamerica, the Andes and Amazon basin of South America, the Sahel region of Africa, and possibly other locations. In each center, people domesticated different plants and animals, developed different agricultural techniques, created different types of society. In the Fertile Crescent, the region arcing from the Nile Valley through modern Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and down through Iraq, people began cultivating wheat and barley, domesticating sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. This happened around 10,000 to 9,000 BCE, making it one of the earliest centers of agriculture. In China, people domesticated millet in the north and rice in the south, along with pigs and chicken. This happened around 9,000 to 8,000 BCE, roughly contemporaneous with the Middle Eastern development. In Mesoamerica, people domesticated maize, corn, beans, squash, and other crops, along with turkeys and dogs. This happened later, around 5,000 to 4,000 BCE, but still independently of developments in the Old World. In the Andes, people domesticated potatoes, quinoa, llamas, and alpacas. In New Guinea, people domesticated various root crops like taro and yam. In the Sahel, people domesticated sorghum, pearl millet, and African rice. Each region developed its own agricultural package based on local wild species that could be domesticated. Why did agriculture develop when it did? Why not earlier? Why not later? These questions have puzzled researchers for decades. Agriculture wasn't obviously advantageous. It required more work than foraging, produced a less varied and less nutritious Diet created health problems from living in larger, more settled communities where diseases could spread. Early farmers were shorter, had more tooth decay, more nutritional deficiencies, more infectious diseases than hunter-gatherers. So why make the transition? Several factors probably contributed. Climate change. The end of the last ice age, around 11,700 years ago, brought warmer, more stable climates. This made certain regions more productive, allowing wild grain fields to become dense and reliable enough that it made sense to stay in one place to harvest them. The climate stability also made agriculture more predictable. Plants would grow in predictable patterns year after year, rather than being disrupted by climatic variability. Population pressure. As human populations grew during the favorable conditions at the end of the Ice Age, hunting and gathering may have become less sustainable. More people meant more pressure on wild resources, potentially leading to depletion of game animals and wild plants. Agriculture, even though it required more work, could produce more food per unit area of land, supporting higher population density, resource abundance. In some regions, particularly the Fertile Crescent, wild grains grew so densely that harvesting them provided enormous amounts of food. This abundance made it worthwhile to stay near the grain fields year-round, to invest in processing technology like grinding stone, and eventually to deliberately plant seeds to ensure future harvest. Technological readiness. By 10,000 BCE, humans had sophisticated tools for plant process, grinding stones, sickles with stone blades, baskets, and containers for storage. They understood plant and animal biology from tens of thousands of years of careful observation. They had fire for clearing land and cooking. The technological foundations for agriculture existed. Social factor. Agriculture required and enabled new forms of social organization. Stored food needed to be protected from theft and pests. Land needed to be managed, with decisions about what to plant where. Disputes needed to be resolved without people simply walking away. These challenges drove the development of more complex social structures, property rights, leadership positions, dispute resolution mechanisms that would eventually lead to chiefdom and state. Feedback loop. Once some people started farming, it created pressures for others to follow. Farmers could support larger populations, could produce more children, could expand into new territory. Neighboring hunter-gatherers might adopt agriculture to compete, or might be displaced by expanding farming population. Agriculture spread not just through the migration of farmers, but through adoption by foragers who saw advantages or felt compelled by circumstances. The transition to agriculture was gradual, not sudden. For thousands of years, people practiced mixed strategy, growing some crops while continuing to hunt and gather wild foods, living in semi-permanent villages, but still moving seasonally, experimenting with cultivating different plants before settling on the most productive one. But over time, agriculture intensified. People became more dependent on their crops, invested more labor in preparing fields and tending plants, stored more food for lean time. Settlements became permanent, growing into villages, then towns, eventually cities. Social hierarchies emerged, with some people specializing in non-food producing roles: craft specialists, religious leaders, warriors, administrators. Trade networks expanded, connecting distant communities, exchanging not just goods, but ideas and technology. And with agriculture came something unprecedented in human history: surplus. Hunter-gatherers lived close to subsistence, consuming most of what they produced, with little left over. But agriculture, despite requiring more work, could produce more food than the farmers themselves needed. This surplus could be stored, traded, or used to support non-producing specialists. Surplus food meant surplus people, people who didn't farm, but did other things. Craftspeople who made pottery, wove textiles, worked metal. Religious specialists who performed rituals, maintained temples, mediated with the divine. Warriors who protected the community or raided neighbors. Administrators who organized labor, managed storage, coordinated trade. And eventually, rulers, kings, and queens, and emperors who commanded resources and people on unprecedented scales. This social stratification, this division into classes and occupation, was new. Hunter-gatherer societies were generally egalitarian, with minimal hierarchy beyond age and gender roles, and perhaps shamans or skilled hunters having higher status. But agricultural societies developed complex hierarchy with permanent differences in wealth, power, and status. Why did people accept these hierarchies? Why didn't they rebel, refuse to hand over their surplus food to rulers and priests? Partly through ideology and religion. The rulers claimed divine authority, or claimed to be intermediaries between people and God, or promised protection and cosmic order in exchange for obedience. Partly through coercion. Rulers had warriors and weapons, could threaten violence against resistance. Partly through genuine services provided. Rulers organized defense, coordinated large construction projects, resolved dispute, managed trade. But also, once hierarchies were established, they became self-reinforcing. Children of elites became elite, inheriting wealth and power. Social mobility was limited. The system perpetuated itself across generations, becoming traditional, natural-seeming, the way things had always been and would always be. Around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, in several regions where agriculture had developed earliest, the first civilizations emerged. Complex societies with cities, writing, monumental architecture, centralized governments, specialized occupations, and extensive trade networks. In Mesopotamia, Sumer developed as a collection of city-states, each centered on a temple complex, with writing systems recording economic transactions and eventually literature and laws. In Egypt, a unified kingdom formed along the Nile, building pyramids and developing hieroglyphic writing. In the Indus Valley, cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro grew to enormous sizes, with sophisticated urban planning and drainage systems. Later, other civilizations emerged: China along the Yellow River, the Minoans and Mycenaeans in the Mediterranean, the Olmecs in Mesoamerica, Norte Chico in Peru. Each developed independently or with minimal contact, each creating complex societies with cities and writing and monumental architecture. These civilizations represented a complete transformation from the hunter-gatherer bands that had spread across the world just 10,000 years earlier. People now lived in cities of tens of thousands, surrounded by strangers, ruled by distant kings, working at specialized occupations, their lives governed by laws and customs far removed from the small-scale personal relationships that had structured human society for hundreds of thousands of years. The psychological and social adaptations required for this transformation were immense. Humans evolved for life in small groups where everyone knew everyone else, where reputation mattered more than rules, where disputes were resolved through personal relationships rather than formal systems. Living in cities with thousands of strangers required new mechanisms, laws instead of custom, police instead of peer pressure, markets instead of reciprocal exchange, money instead of personal favor. Writing was crucial to managing these complex societies. It allowed recording of transaction, keeping of account, codification of law, transmission of information across distances and through time. The earliest writing systems, Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Chinese characters, were developed primarily for administrative purposes, for keeping track of goods and taxes and labor obligations. Only later did writing expand to record literature, history, religious texts, scientific knowledge. With writing came history in the formal sense, events recorded in text that could be consulted by later generations. Before writing, history was oral, passed down through stories and song, changing with each retelling, mixing fact and legend and myth, until the distant past became purely mythical. After writing, events could be recorded more accurately. Dates could be fixed. Causes and effects could be analyzed. Civilizations became conscious of their own history, of the succession of rulers, the pattern of wars and conquest, the rise and fall of dynasties. But writing also created new forms of inequality. Literacy was limited to elites and specialists, scribes, priests, administrators. The masses remained illiterate, dependent on literate elites to record transactions, to know the laws, to access written knowledge. Writing became a tool of power, a way to maintain hierarchy, to justify the rule of kings and priests who claimed exclusive access to sacred texts and legal codes. Part 5. The acceleration of change. For most of human history, change was slow. Tool technologies remained similar for thousands of years. Social structures persisted across countless generations. People lived much as their ancestors had lived, using similar tools, speaking similar languages, practicing similar customs. But with agriculture and civilization, the pace of change accelerated. New technologies were invented more frequently: the wheel, the plow, metallurgy, writing, sailing ships. Social structures became more complex, from bands to tribes to chiefdoms to states to empires. Trade networks expanded, connecting increasingly distant regions, exchanging not just goods but ideas and technology. The domestication of horses around 6,000 years ago transformed warfare and transport. Horse-mounted warriors could strike rapidly, covering distances impossible on foot. Horse-drawn chariots became platforms for archers, dominating battlefields for centuries. Horses enabled nomadic pastoralism on the steppes of Asia, creating mobile societies that would periodically explode out of the grasslands to conquer sedentary civilization. The development of bronze around 5,000 years ago, made by alloying copper with tin, produced tools and weapons harder and more durable than pure copper. Bronze swords and spearheads, bronze armor and shields gave military advantages to societies that had them. The Bronze Age saw the rise of warlike kingdoms competing for resources and territory. The later development of iron metallurgy, around 3,000 years ago, was even more revolutionary. Iron is more abundant than copper, doesn't require alloying with rare tin, and can be made harder than bronze through proper forging and heat treatment. Iron tools were cheaper and more effective than bronze, making them accessible to more people. Iron plows could break heavier soils, opening new lands for agriculture. Iron weapons made infantry more effective, changing warfare. With each new technology, societies changed. Military technologies drove conquest and empire building. Agricultural technologies allowed population growth and expansion into new territory. Transport technology, ships, roads, later canals and railroads, connected distant regions, facilitating trade and cultural exchange. Each innovation built on previous one, creating accelerating change, and societies began to encounter each other in new ways. The migrations of the deep past had scattered humans across the world, creating isolated populations that developed independently for thousands of years. But as populations grew, as technology improved, as trade networks expanded, these isolated populations came back into contact. Sometimes contact was peaceful. Trade, cultural, exchange, intermarriage. Sometimes it was violent, warfare, conquest, enslavement. The pattern repeated across history, expanding empires, absorbing smaller societies, nomadic pastoralists, raiding and conquering sedentary civilizations, seafaring peoples, colonizing islands and coastlines. These encounters mixed populations that had been separated for tens of thousands of years. Genes flowed between populations through intermarriage and conquest. Languages influenced each other, borrowing words and structures. Technologies and ideas spread rapidly when societies with different innovations came into contact. The diversity that had developed during the long period of isolation began to be remixed, creating new combinations, new syntheses. But contact also brought suffering. Diseases that had evolved in one population were devastating when introduced to populations without immunity. When agricultural societies with endemic diseases contacted foraging societies that had never been exposed to those diseases, the results were catastrophic. Measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, influenza. These diseases had co-evolved with humans in agricultural regions, becoming endemic childhood diseases that conferred immunity to survivors. But in populations without prior exposure, they killed adults and children indiscriminately, sometimes wiping out 90% or more of a population. This would happen repeatedly throughout history, most devastatingly when Europeans contacted the Americas after 1492. The indigenous Americans had been isolated for over 10,000 years, had never been exposed to old world diseases, had no immunity. European diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, spread through the Americas like wildfire, killing tens of millions, depopulating entire regions, destroying civilization. The population of the Americas may have declined by 90% in the century after contact, one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. Similar, though, less extreme scenarios played out elsewhere. In Australia when Europeans arrived, in the Pacific Islands, in sub-Saharan Africa, anywhere isolated populations encountered diseases from the wider world. The journey out of Africa, which had scattered humans across the globe, created the conditions for these catastrophes when the scattered population came back to contact. Part 6. The modern world. The pace of change continued to accelerate. The last few hundred years have seen transformations that would have been unimaginable to our ancestors just a few generations back. The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the Information Age, each brought changes that fundamentally altered human life. We went from muscle power and animal power to steam power to electrical power to nuclear power. We went from walking and riding horses to trains to automobiles to airplanes to spacecraft. We went from individual craftsmen to factories to automated production lines to computer-controlled manufacturing. We went from messages carried by runners and ships to telegraph to telephone to radio to television to the internet. In just the last 200 years, we've gone from a world where most people lived, as their ancestors had lived for thousands of years, farming, practicing traditional crafts, living in small communities, to a world where most people live in cities, work at specialized jobs, communicate instantaneously across the globe, travel regularly across continents, have access to information and entertainment unimaginable to previous generations. The human population has exploded. For most of history, population growth was slow, constrained by disease, famine, and warfare. The global population probably reached 1 billion around 1800, after hundreds of thousands of years of human existence. But then, with improved agriculture, medicine, and sanitation, population growth accelerated. We reached 2 billion by 1930, 3 billion by 1960, 4 billion by 1974, 5 billion by 1987, 6 billion by 1999, 7 billion by 2011, and 8 billion by 2022. This population growth has been unevenly distributed. Africa and Asia have grown most rapidly, while Europe and North America have seen slower growth or even population decline. But the overall pattern is clear. In just 200 years, the human population has increased eightfold, from 1 billion to 8 billion, with most of that growth happening in the last 70 years. This population explosion has been supported by technological innovation, the Haber-Bosch process for producing nitrogen fertilizer, the Green Revolution's improved crop variety, mechanized agriculture, global trade in food, that have increased food production even faster than population has grown. Famines, while they still occur, are now usually the result of war or political failures, rather than absolute food shortages. We produce enough food to feed the global population, though distribution remains unequal. But this growth has come at enormous environmental cost. We've transformed the planet's surface, converting forests and grassland to farmland and cities, damming rivers, draining wetland, reshaping coastline. We've driven thousands of species to extinction, are in the midst of what biologists call the sixth mass extinction, a biodiversity crisis comparable to the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. We've altered the atmosphere, increasing carbon dioxide concentrations by 50% through fossil fuel burning, causing global temperatures to rise, triggering climate change that's already affecting weather patterns, sea levels, and ecosystems. In a very real sense, we've become a geological force, a species capable of reshaping the planet itself. The epoch we're living in is increasingly called the Anthropocene, the age of human, recognizing that human activity is now the dominant influence on the Earth's geology and ecosystem, more important than natural forces in determining the planet's trajectory. We've also become increasingly interconnected. The journey out of Africa scattered humans across the world, creating isolated populations. But now, those populations are reconnected more thoroughly than ever before. We have global trade networks moving goods across oceans and continents. We have internet connecting people instantaneously, regardless of distance. We have air travel taking people anywhere on Earth within hours. The isolation that characterized most of human history has ended. This reconnection has mixed populations that were separated for tens of thousands of years. Migration, both voluntary and forced, has brought people of different ancestries together in the same cities, the same countries. Intermarriage is common, creating populations with ancestry from multiple continents. The genetic and cultural diversity that developed during the Great Migration is being remixed, creating new combinations. Languages are dying as smaller language communities are absorbed into larger ones, as children learn dominant languages for economic opportunities rather than their ancestral tongue. Of the 7,000 languages currently spoken, linguists predict that half will be extinct by the end of this century. Each loss represents the disappearance of a unique way of seeing the world, a unique cultural heritage, a unique solution to the problems of human existence. Traditional cultures are being eroded by globalization, by the spread of Western consumer culture, by urbanization that pulls people out of traditional communities and lifeways. Indigenous peoples around the world are struggling to maintain their identities, their languages, their connections to ancestral lands in the face of pressures to assimilate, to modernize, to adopt dominant cultures' ways of life. Yet diversity persists. Despite globalization, despite the spread of dominant languages and cultures, despite increasing interconnection, humans remain remarkably diverse in appearance, language, culture, beliefs. The journey out of Africa created that diversity, and it persists, adapted to modern circumstances, but still reflecting the tens of thousands of years of separate development. And we're still moving, still migrating, though now in ways very different from our ancestors' slow walk across continents. Today's migrations are often driven by war, persecution, economic desperation, climate change, the Syrian refugee crisis, the migration from Central America to the United States, the movement from rural areas to cities worldwide, climate refugees fleeing rising seas and expanding desert. These modern migrations echo the ancient ones in some ways. People leaving their homes, seeking safety or opportunity, adapting to new environments, creating new communities in unfamiliar places. But they're also fundamentally different, happening in a world of borders and nations and immigration laws, a world where movement is controlled and restricted rather than free, where migrants often face hostility rather than empty territories. Part the 7, looking forward. Where do we go from here? The journey out of Africa brought humans to every corner of the earth, adapted us to every terrestrial environment, created the diversity of languages and cultures that characterizes our species. What's the next chapter in this story? Some envision expansion beyond Earth, human settlements on the Moon or Mars, eventually on asteroids or the moons of Jupiter, perhaps eventually to other star systems. This would be the next great migration, taking humans off Earth entirely, repeating on a cosmic scale what our ancestors did when they walked out of Africa. Such expansion faces enormous challenges: the cost, the technology, the biological adaptations required for life in space or on other worlds. But it's not impossible. We've already sent people to the moon, have maintained continuous human presence on the International Space Station for over 20 years, have rovers exploring Mars and probes visiting the outer solar system. The trajectory of technological development suggests that human expansion into space, if we choose to pursue it, and if we survive long enough to do it, is feasible within centuries or possibly decades. Others envision a future where humans remain on Earth, but fundamentally transform themselves through technology, genetic engineering, cybernetic enhancement, uploading consciousness into computers. This would be a different kind of migration, not across space, but across the boundary between biological and post-biological existence, creating something that might or might not still be considered human. But the most immediate future, the one we're living through, involves dealing with the consequences of our success. We've walked out of Africa, conquered the world, multiplied into billions, developed technologies of enormous power. Now we face the challenges that come with that success: climate change, environmental degradation, resource depletion, the risk of nuclear war or other catastrophic technologies, the social and political tensions of an interconnected world with enormous inequality. These challenges are unprecedented in scale, but not in kind. Throughout the journey out of Africa, humans faced environmental changes, resource limitation, competition with other groups, the need to adapt to new conditions. Our ancestors survived ice ages and drought, megafaunal extinctions, and volcanic winter, the challenges of colonizing new continents and adapting to new ecosystems. We have advantages they didn't: scientific understanding of the problems we face, technologies that can address global coordination mechanisms, the accumulated knowledge of thousands of generations. But we also face problems of a scale they never imagined, problems that require not just local adaptation, but global coordination, not just technological solution, but changes in behavior and value, not just survival, but choosing what kind of world we want to create. The journey out of Africa teaches us both hope and humility. Hope because it shows human resilience, adaptability, creativity, the ability to thrive in diverse conditions, to solve problems, to survive challenges that seem insurmountable. Our ancestors walked out of Africa with stone tools and fire, no domestic animals, no agriculture, no writing, no complex technology. They faced megafauna and harsh climates and the need to learn entirely new environments. They succeeded, spreading across the planet, developing cultures and technologies, becoming us. If they could do that with so little, surely we can address the challenges we face with so much more: our knowledge, our technology, our ability to understand and shape the world. The same intelligence and adaptability that allowed our ancestors to colonize the earth can allow us to build a sustainable future. But the journey also teaches humility. We're not separate from nature, not masters of the planet. We're one species among millions, dependent on ecosystem, vulnerable to environmental changes, subject to the same forces that affect all life. We're newcomers, having existed for less than 0.01% of Earth's history, having been civilized for less than 0.001% of that history. The planet existed billions of years before us and will exist billions of years after us. And the journey reminds us of our unity. All the divisions we create, race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, are recent, superficial, culturally constructed. Genetically, we're all nearly identical, all descended from the same small population of Africans who walked out of their homeland 70,000 years ago. The differences between populations, which seem so important to us, involve a tiny fraction of our genome, reflect adaptations to local environments over just a few thousand generations. We're one species, one family, sharing a common story, connected through deep time to our African ancestors and to each other. Every person you've ever met, every person you'll ever meet is your cousin, separated by, at most, a few thousand generations, sharing the vast majority of their DNA with you. Descended from people who made the same journey, faced the same challenges, survived the same gauntlet of environmental and social pressures. This perspective doesn't erase differences, doesn't make cultural diversity less real or less valuable, but it provides context, reminds us that beneath the differences that divide us, we share a common humanity, a common history, a common fate on this small planet spinning through space. Closing, walking with our ancestors as we come to the end of this journey, as we step back from deep time and return to the present, to wherever you are in the world, wherever your ancestors walked to from Africa. Let's carry with us some of what we've learned. You are the product of an unbroken chain of survival stretching back 70,000 years and more, back through the migration out of Africa, back through hundreds of thousands of years of earlier human evolution, back through millions of years of mammalian evolution, back through billions of years of life on Earth. Every one of your ancestors survived to reproduce. Every one of them faced challenges and overcame them. Every one of them passed their genes forward to eventually produce you. You carry in your DNA the story of that journey, markers that trace back to Africa, that show the route your ancestors took, that connect you to specific populations and regions and time. You carry in your body adaptations that your ancestors developed, skin color adapted to the latitude where they settled, immune system genes shaped by the diseases they encountered, digestive enzymes adapted to their diets. You carry in your culture and language echoes of the cultures and languages they develop, words and customs and traditions passed down through countless generations, modified over time, but maintaining threads of connection to the deep past. You carry in your mind the same cognitive abilities that allowed them to survive, the ability to learn, to adapt, to cooperate, to create, to imagine, to tell stories. The journey out of Africa is not over. We're still moving, still adapting, still changing. The world we're creating will shape the future as profoundly as the journey out of Africa shaped the past. The choices we make now, how we address climate change, how we manage resources, how we treat each other, what technologies we develop, what values we embrace, will determine what kind of world our descendants inherit, what kind of future unfolds. And that future, like the past, will be a human future, shaped by the same quality that allowed our ancestors to walk out of Africa and conquer the world: intelligence, adaptability, cooperation, creativity, the ability to envision something beyond the immediate and work toward it, the capacity to survive challenges and emerge stronger. So as you drift towards sleep, as your thoughts slow and soften, as the day releases its grip on your mind, let yourself rest in this knowledge. You are part of a story that began in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago, that spread across the world, that continues today, that reaches into the future. You are connected through deep time to your ancestors who walked those ancient paths, who faced those ancient challenges, who made the journey that brought you to this moment. Feel that connection. Feel the strength they had, the resilience, the courage to walk into unknown territory, to face unknown danger, to persist through hardships we can barely imagine. That strength is in you, inherited through countless generations, encoded in your genes and your culture, waiting to be called upon when you need it. Feel the unity that connects you to every other person on this planet, the common origin, the shared journey, the fundamental similarity beneath superficial differences. You are related to everyone, cousin to all humanity, part of one family that walked out of Africa, together and scattered across the world, and feel hope for the future. If our ancestors could walk across continents with nothing but stone tools and fire, if they could survive ice ages and droughts and predators, if they could adapt to every environment from Arctic to tropical, if they could develop languages and cultures and technologies that would transform the world, then surely we can face the challenges of our time. Surely we can build a world that works, that sustains life, that provides opportunity and dignity for all people, that maintains the beauty and diversity of the natural world. The journey continues. The story isn't finished. What comes next is up to us, to what we choose to do with the intelligence and adaptability and creativity we inherited from our ancestors, with the knowledge and technology we've developed, with the understanding of our history and our place in the larger story of life on Earth. Sleep well, child of Africa, descendant of those who walked, heir to the greatest journey ever taken. Dream of open horizons and footprints in the dust, of ancestors who looked toward the unknown and decided to walk toward it, of the long chain of survivors and adventurers and adapters that connects you to the very beginning of our species. From all of us at Earth's history, thank you for joining this journey into our shared human path, into the story that makes us all family, that reminds us we're all African, all descended from people who had the courage to walk into the unknown and the strength to survive whatever they found there. If this brought you a sense of connection, of belonging to something larger than yourself, of hope for the future based on the resilience of the past, please share it with someone else who needs that perspective. Until next time, rest well. The journey continues, the story unfolds, and you are part of it, carrying forward the legacy of those who walked out of Africa, adding your chapter to the greatest adventure in human history. Good night.